Hello, I'm Sarah, the Skeptical Witch. Welcome back to my channel. This is a place where I like to talk about all things to do with skeptical witchcraft, the psychology of magic, and also religious studies. So if that's what you're interested in, then stick around. I have not made a video in a really long time. I had to take a little break from YouTube and blogging and all that just because it has been a crazy end of the semester with writing final papers and all that, so I was really caught up in all that, but it's now kind of the summer term for me, so I have more time to focus on things like YouTube. So today I want to talk about a somewhat controversial topic, and that is the relationships between science and religion, and specifically this idea of the conflict theory, the idea that religion and science are always incompatible with one another, particularly as it has been kind of put forth and advocated for by the New Atheists. So if you don't know, the New Atheists are basically this very outspoken, very kind of active group of atheists who are very much against religion in all of its forms, really, and who speak out against religion. So they are atheists who do not just not believe in God, but who think that religion should be kind of stopped, and this is something that we should let go of in society and around the world. So New Atheists are usually seen as being led by Richard Dawkins, but they also include Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris as well. So these are kind of like the main four New Atheists. These New Atheists, they tend to see religion as being kind of evil. They see it as being opposed to modern progress. They see it as opposed to science, and they uphold this conflict theory, this idea that science and religion can never be reconciled with one another. If you are a scientific person, you should not or cannot be a religious person who holds religious beliefs. So New Atheism is not as prevalent today as it once was. A few years ago, it was much more popular, but I think that we still encounter this kind of conflict theory a lot in modern Western society, this kind of prevailing idea that science and religion are somehow incompatible with one another. So that's what I want to address in this video. I want to kind of problematize this. I want to break it down, and I want to look at the kind of historical roots of where this conflict theory actually comes from to start to really unpack it and see what's really at play here. So I am approaching this video based off of some of the research that I've been doing lately, so I will leave the resources that I am using for this video down below. So if you're interested in kind of checking out the sources for these things, they will be there for you. So this conflict theory, this idea that science and religion are incompatible with one another, really has its roots in the European Enlightenment. So this was an intellectual and philosophical movement that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it was really about, well, it was a lot of different things. There was kind of a lot of different thoughts and movements that went into this Enlightenment. But there was particularly an emphasis on human beings as rational, reasonable kind of beings, that we have this capacity for reason, and through that we can kind of be masters of ourselves and masters of the world around us. So this was one of the kind of guiding ideas of the Enlightenment, and this was then taken into the 19th century as well. And this was also tied up with the secular Enlightenment as well. So this is the idea that we as these reasonable creatures would move away from magic and religion and these things that are irrational towards the rationality of scientific reason. It was in the 19th century then, during this time, that our kind of understanding of religion as a category and science as a particular category really solidified and kind of came into being as we know them today. It was also during this time in the 19th century that we also see kind of like a scientific enlightenment as well, with people like Darwin and Freud and Marx. So Darwin's origin of species theory of evolution, obviously that challenged kind of taking the Bible literally and challenged creationist kind of thinking about how we came about. And then Karl Marx is also famous for having said that religion is basically the opium of the people, so it's kind of a distraction, a way of making us feel better about our suffering, and it's kind of what's keeping us from rising up and revolting and really kind of achieving freedom. It's important to note, though, that during this time in the 19th century, not all Christians took the Bible literally. And I know that like this kind of evolutionist, creationist debate around Darwin's work is often seen as being this like huge thing, and it was in a lot of ways, but it's also often blown out of proportion, and not every Christian was like a literal creationist. Not every Christian took the Bible literally back then, as many Christians don't necessarily take it literally today as well. So during the 19th century, with all of this progress being made in modern science, we have this kind of archetype coming about of the man of science at the time. So this is a person who is reasonable, who has kind of mastered themselves, and they are able to master the world around them through scientific methods. But while theoretically everyone was kind of thought to be capable of being this reasonable, rational kind of man of science, in actuality, the way that this archetype was created was through the man of science's others. So the gendered, racialized, cultured, and religious others. So what this means is that the kind of ideal man of science was seen as being European, white, male, able-bodied, and anyone who was kind of seen as being in opposition to that, as seen as being the other to that, so women and people of other cultures and other parts of the world practicing different religions, people of different races, they were seen as being less rational. They were seen as being kind of the irrational others of this archetype at the time. And this was very much kind of interwoven with the social Darwinism that was starting to emerge. So this idea that we evolve socially as well, and there are less civilized peoples and there are more civilized peoples, and the West is kind of at the top of that, and it just kind of goes down the hierarchy from there, which is ridiculous and awful and racist, and this has been disproven many times over that this is not how things actually go. Societies don't evolve in this kind of linear way. And anyway, this is maybe something that I'll talk about more in another video that I'm planning to do in the future, but for now, just understand that this kind of idea of the ideal man of science was this white Western male. This obviously has colonial implications, as the West was seen to be this rational, scientific kind of place, and then everywhere else, especially in the East, was seen as being irrational, was seen as being kind of still entrenched in like magical or religious practices that were backwards. They were seen as being kind of barbarians, uncivilized. All of this kind of this discourse came about around these cultural and religious others that then justified the kind of West's domination of them, and justified kind of the West feeling as though they needed to civilize them or kind of, bring them into the fold of progress. This great idea of modern Western progress that was seen as being kind of the end-all be-all at the time. So these ideas of kind of modern Western progress and the opposition between science and religion is also tied up with theories of secularization and the secular that came about in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we see this very much with the 20th century German sociologist Max Weber's theory of rationalization. So this was the idea that modern Western societies are continually moving towards being more rational, towards kind of scientific progress, towards intellectualization, as he calls it. This idea that we're moving away from religion towards science, that we're kind of progressing forward. And this idea that as we are gaining more knowledge about the world, we're gaining more mastery over it, but we're also becoming more isolated from it. So we're kind of distancing ourselves as humans from the world as we learn more about it. And this was something that he saw as being not so great. Like, he wasn't super happy with this kind of the way that modern society is progressing in this sense. He used the term disenchantment to refer to this process whereby scientific thinking replaces the idea of magic being in the world and then comes to replace the idea of religion as well. So it disenchants the world in this sense, and that comes along with intellectualization and this distancing of ourselves from the world. So disenchantment is very much tied up with this Enlightenment narrative of moving from darkness to light, of letting go of magic and religion to embrace science and kind of more reasonable worldviews. And this is very much tied up with like secularization and ideas of secularization, this idea that we are going to become a secular society the more we move towards scientific reason. And this narrative is very much what new atheists hold on to when they bring up this like conflict theory, this idea that religion and science are incompatible. They're very much holding on to these ideas that we had in the like 19th century around the Enlightenment about moving from darkness to light. That's kind of what they are basing their main ideas on, is that we should be moving away from religion as we're getting smarter, as we are like learning more about science, learning more about how the world works. We should be moving away from religion, magic, all these irrational beliefs we should be letting go of. This is kind of like the foundation of new atheist discourse. This narrative is sometimes referred to as the myth of modern progress or as the myth of disenchantment, because this isn't actually what we see happening in the world. There is no kind of linear progress from darkness to light like the Enlightenment expected that there would be or hoped that there would be. There is no evidence to suggest that secularizing forces within society necessarily lead to a disappearance of religion. Religion changes with secularization, but it doesn't disappear entirely. And these secularization theses that were developed in the 60s and 70s have largely been disproven, discredited, and are not really taken seriously within social sciences anymore. Most criticisms of new atheism within academia pick up on the fact that these new atheists are really just regurgitating these Enlightenment narratives, these myths, without critically examining them and without really thinking about what it actually means to be a modern person living in a modern society, or what it really means to be religious today, or what it means to practice science today. So as I touched on, the Enlightenment and this ideal of this man of science, it's really rooted in this kind of colonial ethos in a way, and it is very much based on the oppression of women and people of other cultures and other races. It's creating this idea of this, Western scientific person, man, as being above and beyond everyone else. So it's very hierarchical, it's very patriarchal, and it's very oppressive. And this is something that new atheists don't consider at all when they just regurgitate these Enlightenment narratives. They don't critically engage with where this conflict theory that they are using actually comes from. As Tina Beattie notes in her book on new atheism, these like singular concepts of truth that new atheists promote denies plurality, and it denies people who have different worldviews and tries to erase and silence those views and voices. She notes that scientific rationality, as it's used by the new atheists, is really just one aspect of the Western world's long history of domination and oppression, and of trying to kind of do away with difference, really. Holding on to this idea that there is one singular objective truth that everyone must abide by, it denies voices to people. It denies perspectives and opinions and beliefs and worldviews to other people who are not maybe Westerners, or people who just hold different religious positions. It is part of this Western colonial legacy, and I think it's important to realize that. It's also important for us to recognize that this conflict theory that new atheists promote is not really that founded. It's not really super grounded in reality and how things are. So people who hold religious beliefs are not necessarily going to be opposed to science, and vice versa. This divide between religion and science that the new atheists try to create isn't really as kind of clear-cut for most people. For most people, it's a lot fuzzier than that. So whereas atheist identity is built on this perceived conflict between science and religion, this conflict doesn't necessarily exist in reality. So Amy Unsworth is a sociologist who did an interesting study in the UK that was looking at the relationship between science and religion, and she found, interestingly, that a formal education in science at the kind of high school or university level or higher did not mean that people deconverted or turned to atheism. So there is no real correlation between scientific education and religious belief. She also found when talking to a variety of scientists in the UK that most of them tend to distance themselves from Dawkins and his views. They don't really agree with his position on science and the way that he uses it to discredit religion. I think a lot of scientists don't really see this as being a worthwhile endeavor in a lot of ways. Religion and science are really complex, big, massive categories that incorporate a lot of different things, and they interact in very, very complex ways in people's lives in the West and around the world. So to say that they're just necessarily opposed to one another is just not right. Like, there isn't this harsh divide within society between science on one side and religion on the other. They're intertwined in so many different ways. And the new atheists, I guess, don't really understand this because they're not studying religion in people's lives. They're not studying how religion or science works in people's lives. They're not really looking into religious studies. They're not looking into what's going on in science studies. They're just kind of combating religious beliefs, trying to disprove religious beliefs, or just making these kind of big claims about what religion is without really getting into what's actually going on in people's lived realities. New atheists are very much against religious fundamentalism, but the thing is, they have also been referred to as fundamentalists themselves by a lot of people, and within kind of the academic sphere as well, because they really seem to be spouting this atheist dogma without critically reflecting on where their ideas come from, what this enlightenment kind of narrative that they have is all about. And they have also been accused of promoting scientism, which is basically the promotion of science as the only way of living or the only way of understanding anything about objective reality. So even in situations where science maybe necessarily wouldn't be super helpful, it's kind of the idea that science can tell us absolutely everything about everything, and that's all that matters. The scholar Morteza Hashimi also makes a really interesting point that in promoting these enlightenment kind of reason narratives, the new atheists are actually rooting their arguments in something of a Christian ethos, which is really interesting, I think, because they have this idea of, human beings as all-powerful, all-knowing beings, in that we can know and master our material world through science in a very kind of godlike way. And this godlike idea of human beings is in turn rooted in the kind of Middle Ages Christianity that came about, wherein human beings were seen to be made in the image of God and therefore seen as having some of God's powers or some kind of godly powers to master and know things. But this is a very outdated notion of what science is and what science can kind of tell us about reality. So since then, there have been a lot of critiques of this mainstream idea of science in feminist science studies and post-colonial studies that really show that we as human beings can never really fully objectively know what's out there. We can never really objectively know reality, and this is because we are subjective embodied beings, and we are always going to be wrapped up in our social and cultural and historical kind of positionality, and that is in turn going to affect the way that we interpret, the way that we perceive, the way that we kind of accept scientific theories. So whereas we can develop kind of collectively agreed upon notions of what is probably reality, we can know things with a certain degree of certainty about how the world works, we can never fully know it completely objectively. And we have to keep in mind the fact that the way that we understand scientific theories and the way that scientific theories are formed, it comes from a particular position. So like a particular historical, social, cultural position. Like science does not exist in a vacuum. So this idea that science can somehow be objective and therefore completely neutral is something that Donna Haraway calls the God trick of modern science. This idea that scientists are somehow able to distance themselves from the world and take this God's eye position from above and beyond the world, when in fact we're discovering that this is not the case at all. As embodied socio-cultural beings, we can't distance ourselves from the world fully to know it outside of it somehow. We can't have this like distance view of the world without engaging with it in some way. We always engage with the world that we are studying, right? So science is never neutral, it's never detached, it's never disembodied, and it's never going to take place in a cultural vacuum. It just isn't. Knowledge is always socially, historically, and politically constructed, and it's important to recognize that. Also, this idea that we can never really fully objectively know the world has also been taken up by some scholars, especially around this idea of the ontological turn, where different perspectives and different worldviews are seen as also being different ontologies and different worlds in a sense, which is, you know, an idea that has been debated a lot, but it's also given rise to this kind of critique of science as something objective and neutral. And instead, it's led people to realize that in a way, science is also based on faith and belief, and faith in kind of the theories that we accept about the world. There is an element of belief there, just like religions have an element of belief to them as well. So in that sense, some scholars have argued that really scientific and religious thinking are not all that different from one another, because there is this kind of element of faith in both of them. And you can take that as you will. You can argue against that. People obviously have. Like this is just more to think about how science is not necessarily this like kind of neutral, always objective thing that we think that it is. More recent discoveries in quantum physics especially have shown us that what we know about this world, this reality, is relatively very little. Like, we don't know that much about this reality, and there are things that we can kind of collectively agree upon, but we can never really say for certain that we know something. And there are also other ways of doing science within other cultures that are not the same as kind of modern Western society's idea of science. There are other interpretations of what science is. So like in indigenous cultures, for example, traditional ecological knowledge can be considered a kind of science for them. So I think it's important to recognize that like this Western idea of like the all-powerful, rational man is kind of garbage, and I think should be challenged and discredited, and I think we need new models. We need new things to think with, going beyond this idea of kind of Western science as being the end-all, be-all of everything. And I say this also as someone who is like very interested in science and someone who thinks that science is super, super important. I just think that it's important for us to also challenge our beliefs and challenge what we think about things and what we take for granted. So this is my major problem with the New Atheists, that they promote this kind of conflict theory that comes from this Enlightenment narrative of moving from dark to light without really like considering what that actually means and what the historical roots of that are, and also just promoting this kind of binary way of thinking about things. And I think that binaries are always things that need to be challenged. There is no rigid dualism in this world. Things are more complex than that. It's not just always black and white. And I think that whenever something seems to be that way, it needs to be challenged. So then where does this actually leave us? I would say that even if we accept this idea that science is not necessarily fully objective, it's not neutral, we can still recognize that science is extremely important, and that the kind of scientific method that we use has been incredibly beneficial and has helped us learn so much about the world. It's helped us in so many like medical advances and just technological advances in general. It is necessary and super important, especially today, I think, in this kind of climate of conspiracy theories and science deniers and anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers and people who use science or like misuse science or use pseudoscience to kind of further their own harmful agendas. We need empirical science and the scientific method to combat this, and I think that, you know, it's super important for that. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that it's not neutral and that it is historically and culturally located, and that, you know, modern Western science is not existing in a vacuum. We need to recognize that. Sometimes science and religion do clash with one another, so like in the evolutionists versus creationists debate. But for most people, science and religion do and can exist very harmoniously with one another, and they don't necessarily have to be in conflict. Do I think that religion can be harmful and dangerous? Yes, for sure. Just as a misuse of science can be harmful and dangerous. There are a lot of religious dogmas that are oppressive, that are just horrible and awful, and have been responsible for a lot of atrocities. But also, I don't think that religion as a whole is bad. I don't think that we can kind of lump it all together like that. I think it's a lot more complex than that, and it is obviously very beneficial for some people in various ways. I think that in unpacking this like science-religion conflict debate, we can see that science and religion are categories in society that are actually a lot more fluid than new atheists make them seem. I personally don't believe in gods or spirits or anything like that, but I also see that there's value in that, and I do think that there is something to be gained from that, and to be gained from this like kind of enchanted worldview. As skeptical and atheist witches, we often use science like psychology and cognitive science to understand what's going on in our minds, to help us build our craft and to understand our craft better. And for me, that's great. I really love that. And I think it's really interesting to kind of learn about how the mind works. But this isn't obviously for everyone, and not all witches, not all kind of practitioners want to engage in that. Arguments have been made that like using cognitive science or psychology to explain religious experience or spirituality are like kind of attempts to explain it away and to really reduce it just to like the functions of our mind or something. And not everyone wants to take that like reductive approach. And I don't want to take that reductive approach all the time either, necessarily. Like, I think it's interesting, but there are also some experiences that I've had that maybe could be explained by psychology or whatever, but that I don't want to explain that way. Like, I do like maintaining a sense of kind of enchantment and mystery in my life as well, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Religion can be harmful, but it can also be really beneficial and really meaningful, and these experiences I don't think need to be explained by science. Like, I think a lot of very science-minded atheists would want to put the kind of burden of proof on people who have these experiences, like religious experiences, rather than just letting them have those experiences and kind of letting them believe what they want to believe. But for me, I think if it's not hurting anyone, and if it's just, if it's just beneficial to you, why unnecessarily kind of bring the scientific method in to like try to explain that? I don't think that that's really necessary, and I think that in certain cases that is bordering on kind of scientism, and I don't think that this is something that we should be striving after. This video is probably pretty long, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions about anything that I said, please feel free to ask me in the comments. I will try to answer you as best as I can. This is also something that I'm probably going to write a blog post on, which will kind of go into more detail about some of the things that I discussed here, so you can check that out in a bit once I have that up. And I'm also going to be making like probably 2 or 3 more videos in like a series kind of around this idea of enlightenment, secularization, and kind of humanism that comes out of this period, and I guess my thoughts on that, and some challenges that I think that it poses. So yeah, just looking at like kind of the relationships between religion, the secular, and humanism, and yeah, that kind of thing. So going forward, that's my plan. And yeah, thank you so much for watching again. Also, thank you so much for 1,000 subscribers. Like, that's absolutely crazy. Thank you so much to everyone who has subscribed and who has engaged with my videos. I really appreciate it. I am, loving this community. I am loving the like discussions that we have. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, you're amazing, you're wonderful, and I hope you have an absolutely wonderful, magical